The morning sun cast a golden glow over Jersey City, New Jersey, as Karoline Leavitt adjusted the cuffs of her navy blue blazer, her sharp mind already racing through the events ahead. This wasn't a White House press briefing, nor was it a high-profile debate with reporters. No, today was personal. She grabbed a thermal mug of coffee and a folder full of documents, slid into the driver's seat of her BMW, and pulled out of her driveway. The case was a simple contract dispute involving her family's used truck dealership, and she expected it to be a quick, routine matter, or so she thought. Halfway through her drive, her car's Bluetooth signaled an incoming call. The name flashed on the screen: Daniel Whitaker, senior political advisor at the White House. Karoline's grip tightened around the wheel. A direct call from Whitaker? That usually meant trouble. Before we get into what happens next, I'd love to know what country you're watching from, and I'd like to wish you well. She pressed the answer button. Karoline, we've got a problem. Whitaker's voice came through, tense. The Gulf of America decree is blowing up in the press. The media's twisting it, saying the president's renaming the Gulf of Mexico is unconstitutional. I need you to draft a response, fast. Karoline exhaled sharply, her mind already piecing together a counter-strategy. How long do I have? She asked. Before noon. Can you review the brief and get back to me ASAP? She glanced at the clock. 9:42 a.m. Her court appearance was at 10 o'clock. I'll pull over. Take a look now, she said. Expect a call in 20 minutes. Spotting a small coffee shop, she parked, pulled out her laptop, and immediately got to work. The press's questions were aggressive, their framing strategic, but Karoline knew how to fight back. Fingers flying across the keyboard, she crafted a response that was airtight, sharp, and legally grounded. 25 minutes later, she hit send. Whitaker's text came in almost instantly. Checkmark, quick thinking. This will work. Thanks for prioritizing this. A small smile played on her lips. Even a slight delay had to be worth something. But as she checked the time, her stomach dropped. 9:58 a.m. Her hearing was about to start. Karoline threw her laptop into her bag, jumped into her car, and sped toward the Hudson County Courthouse. A dangerous first impression. The courthouse was already bustling with people when she arrived. She was only a few minutes late, but that small delay would ignite something far greater than she could have imagined. As she slipped through the heavy wooden doors of Judge William Mercer's courtroom, she moved discreetly, not wanting to disrupt the ongoing proceedings. But Mercer's sharp, gray eyes found her instantly. He was notorious in legal circles, strict, unwavering, a man who viewed the law as black and white, and tardiness as a personal affront. His gavel slammed down with a crack. Step forward. The quiet murmurs in the courtroom faded. Karoline straightened her shoulders and walked toward the podium, her presence commanding but calm. Mercer shuffled through his docket, then looked up, his voice like ice. You must be Karoline Leavitt. He emphasized her name in a way that made it clear. He knew exactly who she was. Karoline remained composed. Yes, Your Honor. Mercer leaned back in his chair, studying her. This session was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock sharp, he said, his tone dripping with disapproval. I assume you believe your time is more valuable than this court's? A few heads turned. The tension thickened. Karoline, unfazed, clasped her hands in front of her. No, Your Honor. I apologize for the delay. Mercer wasn't done. I don't need your excuses, he snapped, his voice rising. This isn't a White House press event where you can stroll in whenever you like. This is a court of law. The words hung in the air. Karoline didn't flinch, but she noticed something. A middle-aged businessman had arrived just a few minutes before her. Mercer hadn't said a word. A young woman in a navy suit had quietly taken a seat after the session started, no reprimand. But her? The only one called out. The only one being made an example of. She knew the game he was playing. Mercer flipped through papers, pretending to check something. This court will not tolerate such disregard for procedure. Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality. A cold silence fell over the room. Karoline's mind sharpened like a blade. She had gone head-to-head with hardened political sharks. She had defended Trump against relentless media scrutiny. And now? Now, some local judge thought he could intimidate her over a minor delay? Mercer lifted his gavel. This court hereby finds you in contempt and orders a fine of $500, payable before you leave today. The gavel slammed down. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A young law student in the back furiously scribbled notes, sensing this moment was bigger than just a fine. Karoline? She simply tilted her head, absorbing the weight of his words. $500. For what? For walking in 3 minutes late? Her mind worked swiftly, cataloging everything: his tone, his dismissive manner, the selective enforcement of his so-called rules. She exhaled slowly. Then, she spoke. Your Honor, I have a question. Mercer arched a brow. You are in no position to ask questions. Miss Leavitt. Karoline remained unfazed. I'm just wondering, did you find the gentleman who walked in before me? Or the woman in the navy suit who arrived after me? The silence in the room was deafening. Mercer's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. But Karoline wasn't done. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'd like to request a written explanation for the inconsistency in this ruling. If this courtroom values punctuality above all else, then surely there is documentation showing that all late arrivals today have been fined equally? A slow, hushed murmur spread through the room. Officer James Porter, the courthouse bailiff, shifted uncomfortably. He had worked under Mercer for over a decade, and he knew what everyone in this room was starting to realize. Judge William Mercer had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had tried to humiliate the wrong person, and Karoline Leavitt was about to make him regret it. What do you think? Was Judge Mercer being unfair? Should Karoline fight back, or let it slide? Comment below if you think Karoline should challenge the system. Comment 99 below. The turning point. A tense silence settled over the Hudson County Courthouse as Karoline Leavitt's words hung in the air. The crowd inside the courtroom had seen plenty of cases, but nothing like this. Judge William Mercer sat rigid in his chair, his fingers tightening around the gavel as if it were the last thing keeping him in control. His usual authority, unquestioned, absolute, was slipping through his fingers. He had called Karoline out, believing she would submit like every other defendant he had intimidated over the years. But now, all eyes were on him. Karoline had flipped the script. She had asked the one question Mercer wasn't prepared to answer. If the court truly valued punctuality, where was the record showing that every late arrival had been fined equally? A murmur rippled through the spectators. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others sat motionless, waiting for Mercer's response. In the back of the room, Susan Caldwell, the court clerk, hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had worked for Mercer for years and had typed his rulings countless times. But now she was seeing something she had never seen before. Mercer cleared his throat. Miss Leavitt, this is not a debate. You were late, and this court has the right to enforce penalties for tardiness. Karoline remained perfectly still. Of course, Your Honor, she said evenly. But what concerns me is the selective enforcement of that penalty. A legal system must be consistent to be fair. The murmur grew louder. Mercer's nostrils flared as he adjusted his glasses. Are you accusing this court of unfair treatment? Karoline didn't flinch. I'm asking whether there's documented proof that all late arrivals were fined equally. If so, I'll pay my fine immediately. If not, then I believe this raises a serious question about judicial bias. The air in the room grew thick. Even Officer James Porter, the seasoned bailiff, seemed to shift in his stance. He had worked under Mercer for years, enforcing his rulings without question. But now he was re-evaluating everything. Mercer's jaw clenched. I do not tolerate defiance in my courtroom, he snapped, and I certainly won't be lectured by a. He stopped himself just in time. But the damage was done. Karoline caught the way his eyes flickered. How he nearly said something he shouldn't. Something he knew would expose his true bias. The courtroom felt it too. Mercer had made two critical mistakes. First, he had failed to back up his ruling with evidence. Second, he had let his personal feelings seep into his judgment. A younger, less experienced defendant might have backed down. But Karoline wasn't just anyone. She had spent years navigating the most cutthroat political landscape in America. Standing at the front lines of White House press briefings, fielding relentless scrutiny from journalists who underestimated her. She knew how to control a room. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. Your Honor, she said carefully, I am fully prepared to pay my fine. But first, I would like to file a formal request for a review of today's case records. If I am the only person fined for tardiness, then I would argue that this ruling is not based on court policy but rather on a personal bias." A wave of whispers swept through the crowd. Susan Caldwell turned to Mercer, awaiting his response. Even she wanted to know what he would say. Mercer looked trapped. Karoline had just set a legal precedent, one he couldn't ignore. But before Mercer could respond, another voice cut through the silence. "I second that request." All heads turned. It was Mark Ellsworth, a well-known political advisor and former legal consultant. He had been sitting quietly in the back, observing everything unfold. "If Judge Mercer can't provide documentation proving this fine is consistent with other cases," Ellsworth continued, "then this isn't just a matter of tardiness, it's a violation of constitutional fairness." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Mercer's face went pale. His authority was slipping away. "I will not allow this courtroom to be turned into a spectacle," he barked, his voice rising. "This discussion is over." Karoline smiled faintly. That was the moment she knew she had already won. A just judge would have welcomed transparency. But Mercer? He was terrified of it. Susan Caldwell looked down at her keyboard. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed something into the system. A record, a note that this moment had happened. Mercer's eyes darted between Karoline, Ellsworth, and the spectators. He could feel control slipping through his grasp. The crowd was against him. The court staff was questioning him. And Karoline? She was already 3 steps ahead. Finally, Mercer slammed his gavel down again. "This court is adjourned," he said quickly. "Miss Leavitt, you may leave." Karoline didn't move. "So the fine is dismissed?" she asked, her voice calm, unshaken. Mercer glared at her. "Yes," he hissed. "Just leave." He was desperate to end this. Karoline, ever composed, simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said smoothly. Then, without another word, she picked up her bag, turned on her heel, and walked out of the courtroom. She had entered that room expecting a simple legal dispute. She had left it having dismantled a judge's unchecked power. And she wasn't done yet. As she stepped outside, the first text message lit up her phone. It was from Jessica Monroe, an investigative journalist. "Karoline, I just got a tip that Mercer has a history of disproportionately fining young defendants. I'm pulling records now. Want to comment?" Karoline exhaled slowly. This had just begun. She typed back, "Let's expose the truth." And with that, the battle wasn't just hers anymore. It was America's. What do you think? Did Karoline handle the situation the right way? Do you believe judges should be required to provide full transparency in their rulings? If you support holding the system accountable, comment 99 below. The Hudson County Courthouse was still buzzing long after Karoline Leavitt walked out. Judge William Mercer had expected a routine day, a few hearings, a handful of fines, and no challenges to his authority. Instead, he had just made headlines. The judicial system's silent biases, the kind that had been ignored for years, were now on full display. And Karoline wasn't about to let this fade away. She slid into the backseat of her BMW, her mind already strategizing. The case wasn't over. If Jessica Monroe had uncovered a pattern in Mercer's rulings, then there was a bigger fight ahead. Her phone buzzed. "Jessica Monroe. It's worse than we thought. Mercer disproportionately fined younger defendants, especially women. I have numbers from the last 5 years. Let's talk." Karoline took a deep breath. She had fought battles in the White House press room, countering hostile journalists and defending presidential policies. But this was personal. The evidence that changed everything. That night, Karoline met Jessica in a quiet cafe in Jersey City. The journalist slid a folder across the table, her expression grim. "I pulled Mercer's case records," Jessica said. "Over 75% of his contempt fines were issued to defendants under 30. Karoline skimmed the documents, her mind piecing the puzzle together. Jessica continued, "He also denied payment plans 3 times more often for young defendants, forcing them to pay up front or face legal consequences. And here's the kicker. Middle-aged and older defendants rarely got more than a warning." A fire ignited in Karoline's chest. This wasn't just about her. It was about every young person who had walked into that courtroom, expecting justice, and instead found themselves punished for their age, their inexperience, or simply for challenging authority. Karoline set down the folder. "How many cases do you have documented?" Jessica pulled out her phone. Enough to bury him. The breaking point. The next morning, Hudson County Courthouse was surrounded by reporters. Word had leaked. Judge Mercer was under scrutiny. Inside the courthouse, Susan Caldwell, the court clerk, made her decision. She had worked under Mercer for years, typing every fine, every ruling, every moment of selective enforcement. She walked into the Judicial Oversight Committee's office and handed them a notebook she had kept for over a decade. It contained a list of every questionable ruling Mercer had ever made. By noon, the New Jersey State Bar Association had launched an official review of Mercer's conduct. The fall of a judge. That evening, news broke nationwide. Breaking. Hudson County judge under investigation for judicial bias. Reports indicate Judge William Mercer disproportionately targeted young defendants with excessive fines and harsher penalties. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who recently challenged Mercer's ruling, is at the center of the controversy. Legal experts weigh in. This could reshape how we hold judges accountable in America. As Karoline watched the story explode across every major network, her phone buzzed again. It was from Daniel Whitaker, the White House senior advisor. Karoline, the president wants to capitalize on this. We're drafting a statement on judicial fairness. Be ready for a press conference. Karoline exhaled. The fight was no longer just about Mercer. It was about changing the system. Judge Mercer resigns. 3 days later, Mercer sat in a dark office, watching his career crumble. Phone calls flooded in, from judicial committees, from reporters, from old colleagues who suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. He turned on the TV. Breaking. Judge William Mercer resigns amid allegations of judicial bias. The words hit like a punch. He had spent 30 years ruling from his bench. And now? Now he was finished. Mercer buried his face in his hands. He had underestimated her. He had thought Karoline Leavitt was just a media figure, a spokesperson, a political operative. Instead, she had turned his courtroom into a battlefield and won. A national movement begins. 1 week later, Karoline stood at the White House podium, addressing the nation. This is not just about one judge, she said, her voice steady, powerful. This is about every American who walks into a courtroom expecting fairness but instead faces bias and unchecked authority. She held up a document, the Hudson County Review Report, which outlined not just Mercer's abuses, but systemic flaws across judicial systems nationwide. This is a call to action. She continued, we must demand transparency in our courts. We must ensure equal treatment for all. And today, the White House is supporting a new initiative, the Judicial Fairness Act, to bring accountability to courtrooms across America. The press room erupted with questions. Karoline had entered that courtroom as a defendant. She had left it as the face of reform. In the following months, Mercer's rulings were reviewed, and several defendants had their cases overturned. Hudson County implemented new transparency policies, requiring judges to provide written justification for excessive fines. Other states took notice, with Texas, Florida, and Ohio introducing their own judicial oversight reforms. The change was real, and it had all started with one person standing up and asking a simple question. Where's the proof? Did Karoline do the right thing by challenging Judge Mercer? Should more courts be required to provide full transparency in their rulings? If you believe in holding the system accountable, comment 99 below.